This episode was sponsored by the Geopolitical Insight and Education Foundation. Want to find out more? Check the link in our show notes.
Welcome to another episode of Legal4Tech, the podcast. So, guys, you do recognize my voice. It's always Rosie here. And as I've said many times, this is just a group of students and young professionals who are very interested in anything that has to do with technology and, yes, its regulation. So today I'm joined back by my friend and colleague, Giacomo Di Gregorio. Great to see you, Giacomo. You
Ciao,
left
as
me alone
always.
last time. Let's,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah. And that was not nice. I felt very lonely despite our guests. And we are both interviewing someone who is very kind because they follow us and they also listen to our episodes. But also, she's a great idol of mine. I've been reading basically all of her papers. It's a great pleasure to welcome on the podcast Sue Anne Teo. Great to see you, Sue.
Great to see the both of you too. Thanks for having me here.
Absolutely. As I said, great fan. So I'm super excited to have you here. And in case our listeners haven't heard about you, which I'm not sure, I'm sure they have read something about you. I know our listeners very well. But in case they haven't, what brought you here in terms of career? Why did you kind of decide to specialize in this specific field? And what are you going to talk about today?
Yeah, so maybe just a short introduction about who I am, and then we can get into what we will talk about. I won't start from childbirth, but something a little bit more recent, I think. So I have a human rights practitioner background. I've been working in the field for more than 10 years in various capacities. I worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Malaysia, UN Peacekeeping Mission in East Timor, and then human rights capacity development programs in Myanmar and China and different countries. But at the same time, I've always been interested in technology. I learned how to code, for example, to find out how things worked under the hood. So around 2018, I started to think a little bit more about the convergence of these two worlds, right? Technology on the one side and human rights on the other side, and wanted to sort of dive a little bit deeper into the intersections. So I did a PhD on AI and human rights, looking at the foundational impacts of AI on human rights. I finished my PhD, and then I have a book now on the way on the impact of AI and human rights on human rights foundations. So looking at the conceptual, contextual, and normative foundations. And here I am today, still working on the topic. I'm doing research, publications, writing. I'm a thematic expert on AI and human rights at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden, where I examine the intersections of AI and human rights. I was also a tech and human rights fellow at the Carl Ryan Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I think today we will talk about these intersections, but also maybe a little bit about anthropomorphic AI and emergent vulnerabilities, but we will get into that.
Yeah, and exactly as you said, we want to start exactly with that intersection. As you said, your research focus on AI, but also an important part is the rights of the human person and the broader society. Could you tell us why is that relevant to the understanding of this type of technology?
Yeah, that's a very good place to start, Giacomo. For me, I think that we can no longer sort of cleanly separate tech on the one side and societal and individual implications on the other. So, for example, we can think of a more sort of sociotechnical approach in relation to technology, where societal elements, such as bias and prejudice existing in society are reflected in the tools that we use. So the concern on, for example, AI bias that has been highlighted in the literature also speaks to this. Also, like inequalities, including power imbalances in society, can be embedded and even furthered through technology, where technologies such as facial recognition, surveillance, and other similarly intrusive technologies are deployed to watch, surveil, and control populations. AI supercharges, right, some of these capacities. Then for me, what interests me, the question to ask is then, is human rights law, and I take the point of departure international human rights law. So we can think of, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and so forth. Is international human rights law adequate and equipped to address some of these harms and risks of harms to human rights? But this is also relevant, right, to the EU and other jurisdictions because the interplay between human rights law. In the EU, we have the term fundamental rights. The interplay between human rights law and AI, of course, very important concern here as well, as we will probably speak about.
That's absolutely brilliant. I love how you brought in the concept of international human rights law, because firstly, I mean, these are principles that, the whole of humanity can ascribe to. And with AI being so universal as the digital space in general, it's very important to kind of bring back AI, so the technology that we're all using around the world, to, I think, a very shared conception of human right. So I'm super excited to have this conversation a bit more in detail. We see the interaction of law and technology on a daily basis. I mean, as you said, we're talking about bias, inequality. We're talking about things that have an impact upon every person's life, but that we don't really see. And as a human rights expert, as you are, what kind of concepts are you seeing being threatened by the advent of AI when it comes to human rights and the international conception of them?
Yeah, I think we can look at more sort of direct human rights impacts, but also other human rights impacts, such as impacts on human rights foundations, but also social justice issues that come up, right? We talked in general terms before, but yeah, we can of course go into specific examples. And in relation to specific examples, going into concrete cases, we see, for example, where people have been, discriminated by AI systems in relation to whether it is hiring or university spots allocation in relation to socioeconomic grounds and other grounds. AI systems that use, for example, proxies. These are stand-ins for certain qualities that can inadvertently discriminate against certain groups. At the same time, there are also gaps that arises because not all forms of biases are considered to be discriminatory. Discrimination, equality, and non-discrimination is also a legal standard, right? So certain grounds, certain protected grounds are subjected to this protection, but not all, or at least not yet. So we may be talking about a gap here. Then the question is how this gap can be closed. But at the same time, I think we can also look at the question of, human rights foundations in terms of looking at the power, right? Human rights is also a mechanism in which to put a check on power. And here, some perhaps social justice issues can also come in when AI systems are designed and deployed without, for example, the participation of the people who would either, use or be impacted by the technology, especially in relation to the case of, AI in the public sector, where AI is not just used as a tool, but also a methodology, right? Where increasingly we see the public sector are driven by motivations such as efficiency, but at the same time, the whole purpose of the public sector is that they should be guided by public values, right? So a scholar, Tamar Sharon, calls the fact that this replacement of values that is happening, it can lead to a form of sphere transgression, where because AI is increasingly treated as a methodology, so the values of the public sector are increasingly transgressing, the private sector are increasingly transgressing that of the public sector. And of course, this is in addition to the, black box problem that we are more familiar with in relation to AI. So like the logics of efficiency that is transposed can mean that it can benefit the organization without benefiting the people or the purpose that the organization is set out to serve. I can give you a concrete example, if I may, from Sweden, where I work. So in the city of Gothenburg, the authorities that were, for example, responsible for allocating school placements for children use an algorithm to do this. And in the year this was done, parents noticed some curiosities, right? Some of their children were placed in locations that were really far away and which did not make sense at all. It turns out that the algorithm allocated the spots for the schools based on a straight, bird flight distance line, right? As opposed to how people actually travel to school, which is whether by walking, biking, driving, or taking public transport and what have you. Now, I don't know if you or your listeners have been to Gothenburg, which is, Sweden's second largest city, but there's a big river that divides the city in two. And yeah, getting across the river is not the easiest thing. You need to navigate your way around it. Students, of course, they got allocated these schools that were across the river. The response from the city was that, well, appeal the decision, right? Submit your individual appeals. But this is, of course, altogether insufficient, right? Placing the burden on individuals to correct what is essentially a systemic structural wrong is a social justice issue that individuals are just unable to prove that it is a structural wrong, because the city then refused to share information against the algorithm, and a court case was brought in Sweden to address this injustice. But unfortunately, the court concurred that the city of Gothenburg doesn't need to share the algorithm, and it was only used as a support tool. This means that the individual is systematically, right, disempowered from contesting a structural wrong that impacts the lives of many. And here the human right to education also comes in. And this is also what happens when we buy wholesale the promise of algorithmic efficiencies in a city. The city probably saves some money and staff hours in doing so, but it leaves people in the dark and systematically disempowered, which also goes against the whole promise of human rights, which is individual empowerment, right? But at the same time, of course, I should say that this practice has since been corrected since an audit was commissioned and found many discrepancies. But it goes to show that, using an algorithm is not merely just a tool. It is a way to do things faster, but it's also about transparency, empowerment, power, and justice.
So I absolutely adore that example, because I think that's also one of the many biases of using specific algorithms. I mean, the issue is that when it's a city government, so I guess it's a kind of like a constituency for international listeners. Whenever it's the government in general using one of these algorithms, there is also the kind of public good being evened out on the situation. So, like, the greater good of having a more efficient allocation is viewed as, not saying kind of transferable from the individual's good of having a fair allocation. But let's say that when they actually look at how the algorithms work, they're much less likely to come up with individual remedies that are actionable and quick to action, because it's a government using it. So it's a government body. They have problems with efficiency. They already have slacking governments, and obviously, you really pinpointed the main issue, which is like individual human rights can also become more difficult to uphold when it comes to a government decision that is also made algorithmically. So I absolutely thank you for sharing that example. But there's a huge list of examples in the European Union, also considering that we have Article 22 of the GDPR, and this is still happening in the EU. Just saying, and I'll leave it there. And that's the next question from Jacob.
Yeah, thank you, Rosie. I will ask a question a bit more about laws, even if it's not my field, but but like looking at the law in practice, how have nation states and communities approached those issues, those intersections from between human rights and AI from a regulatory point of view? Because we can think about Europe, where there is the UI Act that tries to solve some of them. But do you think that it has done that successfully, or it gets some, I don't know, some holes?
Yeah, I think it's maybe too early to tell whether or not the regulatory efforts here in the EU will be successful because, for example, even the EU AI Act is being changed even before some of the key provisions become applicable, as you and your listeners are aware through the digital AI omnibus and the data omnibus. And the Brussels effect is maybe unlikely to be the same as compared to the GDPR, even though some countries such as South Korea adopted more or less the same model minus the prohibitions. I think even if the EU AI Act is the first in the world to comprehensively regulate AI, other countries also have their ways to regulate AI, even if it's not a similar comprehensive approach. It's more through sort of, for example, sectoral regulation. And here we can think of maybe the US, which, although there's no federal regulation on AI, there are executive instruments such as executive orders and policies that determine or recommend, for example, what companies can do with their AI models. You might have read in the news. In China, AI is also sectorally regulated, whereby certain issues such as algorithmic recommendation systems are regulated alongside other concerns such as, human likeness of AI. And though the Chinese may adopt a more comprehensive approach to internet regulation soon, let's see. We can say that the value systems for these different regulatory focuses, they are different, with a more sort of market oriented approach for the US, more Chinese values driven approach, and a fundamental rights approach in the EU. Of course, this is a very, very broad generalization. But to answer your question, it is too early to tell, I think, if the EU AI Act is or will be successful, as political winds have blown us in a different direction now, a deregulatory one. At the same time, I also acknowledge the need to grow our industries and have less technological reliance throughout the tech stack on other actors such as the US. And while regulation cannot be blamed for the lack of EU competitiveness in this area, I also note and take on board what the small and medium-sized businesses have said about the impact of different regulation. For example, the GDPR, that it has made certain compliance costs a little bit higher. And I think for in relation to the AI Act, we can take on board the need for legal certainty. So in several projects that I work with right now, that is a common complaint from industry. For example, a lab designing a European-based large language model, they need to know with certainty what types of data they can use to train their models with, right? And we need to address this together with other more pressing concerns that have been highlighted by other scholars such as Anu Bradford, that affect EU competitiveness, such as the lack of investment here in the EU and the more conservative risk-taking perspectives here in the EU. So I would say it's a whole package.
You mentioned the regulations around the world. You also mentioned China, and China has a specific view on AI chatbot because they have caused several issues, especially the use of chatbots has been quite in conflict with Chinese, let's say, a strategy, governmental strategy. We're talking about, in China, they have plans. It's a bit more easy to plan things, let's say. And chatbots have had the issue of being too similar to people and creating relationships that then hindered, let's say, actual interpersonal relationships. In the EU, we have a big question mark on AI chatbots due to the fact that the AI Act was basically ratified, I think, was it a month or a week, something along the lines, before ChatGPT became the global phenomenon that it has become in 2024. So looking at the issues we've discussed in relation to human rights and the international conception of human rights, how would you kind of bring this topic to chatbots, how would you apply the conversation we've had to the use, deployment, and abuse of AI chatbot?
Yeah, I think the use and increasing popularity of AI chatbots raises some key legal issues and gaps. Some of this have also to do with human rights. For example, in relation to the freedom of thought, we have the right not to be manipulated in exercising our freedom of thought. But then we have to sort of unpack what that means, right? And it doesn't help our case that the freedom of thought doesn't have a lot of case law behind it as well. But I think to go through the sort of issues in relation to AI chatbots in general, just to sort of set the picture, we can maybe see that, or maybe a lot of your listeners are familiar that there are a lot of these cases that have been highlighted in the media. Some tragic cases, right, which implicates chatbot use, including some where chatbots, coach people to harm themselves or to commit suicide and so on. These are rightly so very disturbing cases and deserve attention. They're also the subject of lawsuits in the US. At the same time, there are millions of users of chatbots, not only of the more sort of companion type chatbots, but also general chatbots such as ChatGPT, where people use in a more social way, right? And research has also shown that many people find these chatbots to be useful and that it fulfills their social, professional, and personal needs. Of course, being general purpose, it means that chatbots can be used for almost anything, right? Worries, professional, school, family, relationships, you name it. And it's also difficult to beat an always available, seemingly understanding chatbot that can output sensible responses that addresses your concerns and needs. We all use it because at least it addresses some of our needs. But the part about the harms or possible harms are also important to address. As mentioned, there have been some obvious harms, such as the cases of suicide and where people have been encouraged to commit violent acts and so on. And the lawsuits in the US have pursued this from a product liability perspective, alleging that the product was defective or that the companies were negligent in designing and deploying some of these products, knowing that harms could or would result from them. One case has been settled out of court, but there's others underway. Here in the EU, we have, let's say, the lowest common denominator, including in terms of legal requirements for such chatbots, namely the fact that there are transparency requirements for chatbot platforms to inform users that they are interacting with a chatbot, not a human. And this, to me, actually does not go far enough. There's research to show that individuals actually don't care that they are interacting with a chatbot. They fall in love anyway, or they trust their chatbot and over depend on them anyway, sometimes over human counterparts, right? At the same time, general purpose AI models also have obligations under the AI Act, but this is differentiated according to whether or not these models pose systemic risks or not, and this is determined by a compute threshold. So there are obligations around sharing of information, including on training data and copyright and so on. And then for models with systemic risks, more obligations around testing and evaluation. So these are like ex ante obligations, but also ex post obligations also come into the picture. This means, ex post means after the fact. So this means that, for example, product liability law can come into the picture if physical harm or psychological harm results as a result of the use of these AI chatbots. But of course, this may be a case of too little too late if the harm has already occurred, for example, if a person has already passed away. And you quite rightly said that there's a bit of a lag, a gap in the regulation. Basically, there's a patchwork of obligations right now in relation to chatbots, none of which directly or squarely addresses some of the harms that we are familiar with in terms of interactions with chatbots. The obligations are certainly there, and then there's ex post accountability mechanisms as well. But on the other hand, some, let's say, features of these chatbots could also contribute to harms, and these are less obvious, or rather, the harms may only emerge over time, right? Due to accumulation of factors. But we don't have enough research, including empirical research in these areas, to make strong conclusions about its harmful effects. Okay, what do I mean? These include, for example, as you mentioned before, the human likeness, the anthropomorphic language used by chatbots. It might confuse some people in terms of thinking that they are interacting with a person instead of a chatbot. At the same time, a certain degree of anthropomorphic or human-like imputation is inevitable due to the fact that language is used in these chatbots, and human language, right? We are the only living beings that have mastered language. So this imputation is inevitable on our part. However, there are also, at the same time, anthropomorphic features designed into the product that is maybe not necessary for the service, such as chatbots having a backstory, like history or personality, using pronouns such as I, or seeming to have experiences, such as when it expresses itself as missing you, thinking about you, caring for you, praising you, and so on, which can not only be misleading, but potentially manipulative. The other feature is sycophancy, right, which is excessive agreeability by the chatbot towards whatever you have to say, or which aims to please you. Sycophantic AI models means that it rarely pushes back against what we say. This means that we might get affirmed or validated, perhaps in terms of some of our more problematic thoughts, which could also lead us to further believing in our own positions and our own positions only as being correct. So if we use, for example, chatbots as therapists, this is, of course, an unrealistic expectation, as no human therapist will likely affirm everything a patient brings to the table. They will also, for example, challenge a patient to think through their actions. Sycophantic models have also been demonstrated in research to be less accurate, as the desire to please, as you can imagine, can also include saying something is not wrong when it is wrong. And the third thing that I want to mention is the fact that chatbots can also demonstrate what is called emulated empathy, wherein, because of human language and the fact that it has been trained on human-generated data, which includes, of course, expressions of emotions and feelings, a chatbot's response can seem as if it is very understanding and empathetic. And together with, the sycophancy that we just talked about, and the fact that chatbots are available 24/7, empathy that is emulated by a chatbot can make users go to it for concerns almost by default, right? And can lead in some cases to users preferring such a low friction interaction compared to interacting with humans. That's one thing. The other thing is the possibility of emotional manipulation. And here I can say a study by De Freitas and others, which have looked into how chatbots have used emotionally manipulative language to prevent users from leaving the apps. This, of course, tugs on our emotional heartstrings, and we might feel guilty for leaving the app, for example. So I think these elements, anthropomorphism, sycophancy, and emulated empathy, while not harmful sort of in and of themselves, they're just features. They might contribute towards new or emergent vulnerabilities or harms. And I think this is insufficiently addressed under the law, also because it's very difficult to measure it. But this is what I look at in my research project.
I loved your explanation, how you kind of listed the issues. And I think, I mean, the AI Act in this technically does prohibit specific behaviors, specific practices of AI systems, including, of course, chatbots and manipulation or the exploitation of vulnerabilities. Technically, is in there. We're talking about Article 5, which I've seen has now become Article 6 because they shifted everything around. Anyways, 5 now 6. The issue is that the threshold is very high. It is like manipulation in the sense that there is a kind of will of the company to manipulate and to exploit a specific feature of the person. It's a very high threshold. It's a significancy threshold, which obviously is not easy to reach, luckily enough. Also, it probably wouldn't be appreciated by such a great number of users. Because I think the level of sycophancy, of empathy that chatbots can afford is still kind of like in the middle, because otherwise it wouldn't be such a widespread kind of um, marketing technique. So
Yeah,
I think that
absolutely.
that's the issue of law. Like, you can't get that level because that's the perfection reached through studies on populations, because that's what marketing does. That's what product placement is. But for the law, it's a bit more difficult to get that, very, very little kind of border beyond which you shouldn't go. Otherwise, you risk to create problems in individuals and societies. So yeah. Thank you for this explanation. It was, I
Yeah,
think, brilliant.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think that is the saying, at least, because of this high threshold. It's likely very difficult to meet that threshold. And I think it's also sort of for good reason, because we don't want to simply ban things, right?
Yeah.
A lot of users also actually prefer sycophantic models, because it responds to them in a very nice way, right? But at the same time, individual preferences, we have to weigh individual preferences also against, societal harm, right? And we have seen, for example, this play out in other sectors, whether it is in relation to gambling or cigarettes and so forth. I think it's still very early days for the chatbot industry, let's say. And I think also we need a stronger evidence base, or the law should actually follow what is happening in practice, which is hopefully something that I hope to address in my research.
That's it is something that we need also, like, in terms, as you said, I think the harms to individuals versus the harms to society, because that it is something that is said about, for example, cigarette smoking. I am free to smoke cigarettes my whole life, and possibly, like, eventually, sadly, experience the side effects. So, I mean, lung cancer, we know them all. They are written everywhere, literally in every single shop. Um, at the same time, like, that's posing a risk to society, because then the NHS or the national healthcare services of each country then have to take care of you, because that's a human right to health. So that poses a threat to the stability of society by the abuse of an individual, basically. And it's fine if you like sycophancy, but then if you start being kind of adverse to confrontation, that's a problem of the whole of society. Then that becomes, a small problem for an individual, something that they are prepared to put up with. But when you scale it up to the whole of society, that is something undesirable. Then the law needs to regulate. So it's difficult to find a balance. But I'm excited to know more about your research. So I'm going to ask Giacomo to go on with the next question.
Yeah. We want to know more about the project that you recently launched. very interesting. That's called, if I'm not wrong, Anthropomorphic AI and Emerging Vulnerabilities. Can you tell us more, like what it's about and how can we interact with it?
Yeah, of course. More than happy to. There's two key elements that you mentioned that you touch upon in the project, which is anthropomorphic AI, meaning human-like, and also emergent vulnerabilities. So on the first point, anthropomorphic AI. Of course, AI has been around for some time, but it has not always been human-like, right? We have had predictive AI available for some time now, where AI is used in, for example, particular domains such as fraud detection, welfare allocation, predictive policing, and so on. But with generative AI, especially large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, the companion apps, these chatbots, they actually interact with us, right, in a language we know and understand, and with performance of emotions. So it seems very human-like. Now, I've also said before that anthropomorphism is not per se a design quality, meaning that we ourselves impute human likeness to things. And we can, of course, think of things like, cars. We name our cars, or our pets. We name things. We put googly eyes on things that should not have googly eyes, for example. At the same time, some anthropomorphic qualities are, of course, designed for engagement when it comes to chatbots, to get people comfortable using the app, to trust it, and to continue using it over time. There's a commercial motivation to it. The human likeness of AI, whether in terms of how we interact with it, why we interact with it, may cause some new risks. And I analyzed this from the perspective of emergent vulnerabilities. So the second part is the emergent vulnerabilities part. What do I mean by this? So with some of the cases of risks and harms arising through interacting with chatbots, we can see that people who interact with chatbots become vulnerable over time, even if they were not vulnerable in the first place. This raises potentially two issues for the law, or maybe more. Let's see. There's potentially a gap in regulating emergent vulnerabilities. And secondly, what are even these vulnerabilities? How do they arise? How do we identify them and measure them? So first, how the law treats vulnerabilities do not actually address vulnerabilities that tend to emerge over time from interactions with AI chatbots, right? We can think of how the law addresses vulnerabilities today. So, for example, children have more protections, for example, on the right to privacy on account of their vulnerability, that they have developing minds, that their weaknesses might be exploited, and so on. Non-discrimination law also addresses vulnerabilities. Certain groups should be protected because they have been subjected to historical and, in many cases, ongoing prejudice and discrimination. What we can sort of gather from this is that the law adopts primarily a group-based approach to vulnerability. So certain groups are deemed more vulnerable than others, and therefore deserving of more protection. In other words, vulnerabilities must be known in advance so that the law can, draw the ring fence of protection around it, right? It sounds logical. But this might not work when it comes to AI chatbots, wherein vulnerabilities might emerge due to the interaction itself and might emerge over time the more we use the chatbot. We have seen, for example, some cases on AI psychosis, although this term is still contested, where seemingly functioning individuals, right, without any sort of specific mental or physical conditions, they slowly began losing grip on reality the more they interacted with the chatbot. And this is, of course, not the only emergent vulnerability. We also see people having forms of overdependency on their chatbots, which can open room for exploitation or manipulation by the company behind the chatbot. We also see cases involving guardrails, which are these safeguards that the companies design in their AI models. These guardrails can fail over time, which is also an emergent vulnerability, because then it becomes unpredictable how the chatbot would respond over time. And also increasingly, many people use these chatbots for therapy purposes, even if it's not a therapy app per se. In fact, in a report by the Harvard Business School, I think it was by Zal Sanders, it was found that people's main use of chatbots were in a therapy or companionship role 2 years in a row, right? So both this year and the previous year. There are, of course, benefits, but also risks, some of which we are familiar with, such as the handling of sensitive personal data, data protection, privacy, but also potentially others. Could think of the impacts on human relationships, the impacts on mental health, and which may also cause users to harm themselves or others. And again, we need to see sort of how this unfolds over time through turn-by-turn interactions and through a trust relationship that is built up over time. So in this project, what we do is that we adopt an empirically informed legal approach that addresses these emergent vulnerabilities. It's not that common an approach. So we're currently doing surveys with users of AI chatbots if they use the chatbot for social or companionship purposes. And there will also be a longitudinal study in the second phase where we will follow closely the interactions of individuals with their AI chatbots for 1 whole year. There's as yet not much that is known about such interactions, and going beyond the headlines to hear and learn from the lived experiences of people is essential in how we approach this, I think, in order to inform legal recommendations and also design standards and legislative efforts in general. We, of course, want to keep harms at bay, but at the same time also support user autonomy. And we don't want to regulate based on moral panic. So that's where the empirical part comes in. And if your listeners are interested, if this sounds interesting to them, they can follow us on LinkedIn. We have a page called Anthropomorphic AI and Emergent Vulnerabilities. Sorry, it's a mouthful. But also they can follow our website, chatbotresearch.se. That's a little bit easier.
Perfect, and they will find the link in our show notes. I was wondering, and then I promise you the last question. How are you coping with the ethical challenges in this specific type of study? Because, I mean, it's great that you see the interaction, of course, and it's very needed, but you are asking some people to interact with a chatbot for a whole year. What are the ethical considerations? I'm always wondering in this case, like it's not just a data protection point, I think, because you're still like looking at a lot of data being shared. But I think it's like for the benefit of the many, you are, I mean, putting some people in danger in a way. So how are you approaching this, like in terms of the study?
Yeah, so we're not doing a randomized control trial. We're not asking people to interact with their chatbots. We are approaching people who are already interacting with their chatbots. And what we will do, our role is just to follow that interaction, understand their experiences over time. And I think this over time bit is very important because there's not that much research on what happens to people over time. Also, we see a lot of AI model evaluations being done. Yes, they are good, but they look at this prompt, what happens, that prompt, what happens, but they don't look at what happens to people over time, the effects on people over time. even though it is not a randomized controlled trial, obviously some ethical and legal issues also come in relation to, of course, the use of data. So here, classical, practice is for informed consent to be there. And because we will also handle sensitive personal data, we have adopted a high security data storage solution, which is used by, medical researchers and so on. So we have thought about all of those issues. At the same time, I also acknowledge that, of course, people need to themselves trust us with this project, and I'm very happy that many people have come on board. Even for the first part of our research, the surveys, we got so many responses in such a short time. So I'm happy that people want to share their experiences, and I will not, of course, abuse this trust. I will hold it tightly in my heart, but also as a responsible researcher to carry it out properly and to follow proper data protection and informed consent practices.
Wow. So that's, I would say, what we need to do is all follow the project. As we said, they will find, all of our listeners will find the link in our show notes. I think that was all for this interview. Thank you so much, Sue, for joining us today. This was a brilliant conversation. So really, thank you so much, and keep on listening.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Giacomo. Great. Thanks for everything, and thanks for actually helping with the editing of this podcast as well.
No problem, as always. Thanks to you.
And this was all for Legal4Tech, the podcast.
This episode was brought to you in partnership with DG Beetle. DG Beetle helps privacy professionals to stay up to date with the most important European documents in the AI, data and digital space every day. Curious to know more? Check out the link in our show notes.